I'm working on a book entitled Adventures in Limnology. I thought that I've had enough close calls that it might be worth putting in print. It's 32 chapters now, finished, and I'll be looking for a publisher, which may be very hard to find. But, and if that fails, of course, I'll self-publish. I also wanted to introduce at this time the board director of the League Disabled Lake Tahoe, Steve Spurlock. Stand up, Steve. And that's particularly important because without the League Disabled Lake Tahoe, so much of the early science would not have gotten anywhere. And we owe the League for taking on major operations. There was a lot of opposition in the early days. I was sort of a bad guy on the view of the developers that wanted unlimited development excuse in the basin. And I actually got threatening phone calls and was, for some reason, escorted down Highway 80 after these public meetings by the highway patrol. Now, I'm not sure whether they were looking to give me a ticket or whether they were protecting me, but it made me extremely nervous. I'd pull off one intersection, there'd be another one waiting for me. So it kept me below the speed limit all the way down to dead. I'd like to dedicate this talk to Bob Richards, the captain of the John LeConte for many years, and his wife, who worked so closely with him in both public relations and keeping Bob happy all those years he was with us. There's a special celebration of her life on June 29th, and you can find that on the Turk website. Details, if you don't remember it now. One of the exciting events we had at Tahoe was, of course, getting both Clinton and Gore out on the boat. And the reason I put this slide up is to remind people that Kit Richards actually cooked a bunch of chocolate chip cookies that were on the right side of the boat when the president came aboard. I tried hard to memorize my lines, "Welcome aboard, Mr. President." And the Secret Service had brought, of course, the football aboard in case they needed to launch a counterattack. And they also brought aboard a bulletproof blanket. And if we came under fire from shore, then Clinton was supposed to rush to the bow of the John LeConte, hop on the porta potty, and be covered by this blanket. In the meantime, the rest of us were all designated as non-protectees. Since this is partly a talk for the docents, I'm going to make a quick recovery of some history of Tahoe. In the 1800s, when silver was discovered at Virginia City, they essentially butchered the Tahoe Basin. It was clear-cut, just incredibly uncarefully, all over the basin, and there wasn't a lot of original forest left. We still see some of those magnificent trees, but they were few and far between. If you go offshore and core the sediments, you can still find the sawdust from the sawdust mill at Glenbrook. Over the years, Tahoe recovered. This is the same picture in 1980. The problem was that the forest came back too heavy, too thick, and we have a considerable fire danger now, of course, in the basin that keeps people really awake at night. The lumber mills were finally closed in 1895. We got a railway up to the lake along the Truckee River. Crayfish were introduced. I'll say more about them later. Auto route encircled the lake, end of the drought that brought so many people west, including, what's his name, wrote Steinbeck. Steinbeck's first book. Nobody's ever heard of it, and it's a tough read. It's entitled Cup of Gold, and it didn't give much encouragement for his future fame, but it arrived anyway. So we had the end of the drought. Lots of Okies came west. The Kokanee salmon were introduced. Squaw Valley was selected for the Olympics. The Tahoe Keys was created. That's something that probably would not have been allowed currently. Mysis relicta, which you've heard about earlier, the docents have, was introduced all over the West. And fortunately for us, they didn't consult us on the matter. And so we weren't involved in that misintroduction. Finally, we got sewage exported from the basin, and the cladocerans crashed, eliminating the major food supply for the Kokanee salmon. I don't know what that was. As we leave history, I want to look ahead. Taking care of the younger generation became really important. And over 20 years ago, we created Children's Day at Lake Tahoe, which brought kids in to learn about conservation, actually look at some of the organisms. And the education program has been carried on mainly under the direction of Heather Sigali, who's done a wonderful job in promoting education. But on to the primary productivity, nutrient limiting, water clarity, and sewage disposal. If I can brag about one thing that I accomplished at Tahoe over the years, it was convincing 6 sanitary engineers. They weren't environmental engineers in those days. They were sanitary engineers, but they couldn't put tertiary treated sewage water back into Lake Tahoe. They were bound and determined to do that because the whole country was going towards tertiary. Energy was cheap, and you could produce really good water. The problem at South Tahoe was that the nitrogen went right through the plant as ammonia. They got the phosphorus out, the heavy metals out, but the nitrogen went right through the plant. And in those days, Lake Tahoe was a classic nitrogen-limited western lake, where the eastern lakes tend to be phosphorus-limited, western lakes tend to be short of nitrogen. So any nitrogen you put into the lake would cause an algal bloom. So let's talk about I'll stop bragging after this. Lake Tahoe is considered a classic leucotrophic lake, a lake of low fertility. It was actually, by the time LeConte made the first measurements of transparency in 1887 and published it in the Overland Monthly, which was a stagecoach journal at the time. And the other connection that I've just come up with recently is the fact that he was communicating with the father of limnology at Lake Geneva in Switzerland by mail. And he discovered learned from the father of limnology that we had a device called a Secchi disc, which the Pope aboard the Immaculate Concezione in Italy used for checking out transparency where they were trying to convert coastal cities to Catholicism. Some of those ports didn't want the Pope's boat in, and they put chains across. So if you hit a chain with a wooden hulled sailboat in those days, you had a problem. So Father Secchi, a really talented scientist, was aboard the Immaculate Concepzione and devised the Secchi disc, which was simply, thank you, simply a steel ring covered with a piece of canvas painted flat white. And you lower it, of course, into the water till it just disappears. You pull it up until you can see it again. And halfway between is technically where it disappeared. So this gave them a measure of how far into the water they could see for obstacles like rocks or chains or anything that might hinder nearshore navigation. So that's Tahoe and the Lake. This is a lot of fun up there. So we'll go back. I don't want you to forget how beautiful and oligotrophic Lake Tahoe is. It's actually, I'd say, ultra oligotrophic. 30 years ago, it's oligotrophic now, but we've lost about a foot of transparency per year since I got here in 1958. Castle Lake actually is responsible for the first measurements that we were able to make. My first grant from the National Science Foundation was for Castle Lake, and the equipment I was able to buy to do the work at Castle Lake also could come to Tahoe. So we got a start in the early 1960s and really got into gear about 1964. So that's a mesotrophic lake, a lake that's considerably more productive, a good fish producer. And this is Lake Biwa in Japan, which is also a mesotrophic lake, but shows the importance of lakes for human life. 14 million people depend upon Lake Biwa for a water supply. And it's unfortunately becoming increasingly eutrophic too. And if things get really bad, this is Lake Tahoe in China, which you can almost walk on the blue greens growing there. This is a Tahoe graduate who's risen to considerable fame in the nitrogen studies he's done out of North Carolina. Our new director mentioned Carol Folt. That's the third president of a university. She's the president of USC, and she did her thesis on chemical warfare between animal plankton in Lake Tahoe, where one zooplankton emits a pheromone that slows down the filtering capacity of another one. So it was really exciting work. And of course, John LeConte was the first president, acting president, and second president of the University of California at Davis. And that was a really important event. Burge became a limnologist, who was a limnologist, with his associated Jude, did a lot of the early 1900 work in limnology at the University of Wisconsin, and now we have Carol Folt at the university. So limnologists are coming up in the world. Okay, why is Tahoe so clear? Well, most lakes, if we talk about productive lakes, have a watershed maybe 10 to 1 for lake surface. Tahoe has only 1.6 to 1, so that a lot of the precipitation falls directly on the lake rather than on the watershed. And we have a very decomposed granite watershed, so we don't get a lot of nutrients in from the watershed. And this was a big surprise to us when we began to consider some of the ecological considerations, which, for instance, meadows, which have been lost in large part around lakes in the world, are wonderful for filtering out sediment and removing nutrients. And of course, the Pope Marsh was very important in that respect. Septic tanks rounded the lake when I got here. Nobody was on a sewer line. And eventually, they brought in these super sanitary engineers, McGahey and Pearson, two famous ones from Berkeley, Kaufman from Stanford, Hassler, a limnologist, and Rolich, an engineer from the University of Wisconsin, to consider what to do with the sewage. They had a $100,000 grant in 1960 from the Flashman Foundation. I ran that up with Google, and that's over $1 million in today's money. And they did this study, and they hired me to provide what limnological data I had by then. And this put me in the position of evaluating the tertiary treated effluent into Tahoe. And if they had put that in, it would have been a disaster. And I made a very simple experiment. I simply took mid-lake water, added a few parts per billion of their effluent, and turned it green in 3 days. And because I was just an instructor at Davis at the time, I had a great salary of $52.32 per year. They weren't sure about this kid from the east. Came out from the University of Michigan in 1958 with all my possessions in an aluminum canoe on top of the station wagon and 2 kids rattling around. So anyway, they then decided that they'd check me out. So they notified the Swiss sanitary group, and they dispatched Karl Wuhrmann, an engineer from Switzerland, to check my work. And fortunately for the lake and for me, it checked out, and they settled then on export of sewage from the basin, and we got the lake sewered. And other lakes in the world are attempting to follow suit. The latest we've tried on is Lake Atitlan in Costa Rica, and that has failed. Just not enough funds to do it there. But this is seepage from a septic tank during a high rain period when the water from a septic leach field reached the surface and promoted this little algal bloom from just seepage. When it reaches the lake, it promoted a huge periphyton attached to algal growth of Gomphonia herculeum, a stalked diatom. And as the spring progresses and the solar radiation increases, this stuff bleaches, looks like snow on the bottom of the lake at the time, and then it breaks loose, turns up in the boat works and along the shores as a noxious mess. And that continued for several years after the sewage was exported from the basin, because there was a supply of it in the groundwater, which gradually made its way to the lake. I'm sorry to report that our main early PhD periphyton specialist, Stan Loeb, died of cancer a few weeks back. And some of you who might have known Bruce Kimmel at Oak Ridge National Laboratory also is deceased. So I've outlived some of my students, which is remarkable. If you look at the insurance actuaries, I shouldn't be here. So we had serious erosion in the basin. This was the not so heavenly view of Heavenly Valley back in the late 60s. And this shows an important piece of work that Scott Hackley, where are you, Scott? Stand up for a minute. Come on, Scott, up and at 'em. Anyway, Scott helped me put a few slides together for this talk. And Scott kept this bioassay. A lot of those, I would guess, probably 95% of those bioassays Scott did. And 58 nitrogen experiments and 50 phosphorus experiments showed that from the 60s and to the 80s, that nitrogen was the main stimulant for algal growth in Lake Tahoe. By 1982, there had been so much nitrogen introduced to the lake, mainly from the atmosphere, that the lake had switched to a more phosphorus sensitive or a co-limited situation. This shows the deposition, atmospheric deposition, the blue on the left, versus the runoff from the streams we calculated on the right. And we were absolutely flabbergasted to discover how much atmospheric input there was. But it follows, since the rain falls largely on the lake and not on the watershed, it's not so surprising to consider. But this shift that occurred made it possible to win probably the preeminent lawsuit brought against the states of California and Nevada by William Cody Kelly, who happened to be the great-grandson of Wild Bill Cody himself. And he developed the Upaway project, which was a good project. It was very carefully done, but then he wanted to go on up the slope, the erodible slopes behind it. And the fact that phosphorus is so associated with sediment input, we used this data to win the case in Nevada, upheld by the Nevada Supreme Court, which, had that case been lost, control in the basin would have been totally lost. We also get smoke, and smoke is a pretty potent fertilizer, it turns out. It has two impacts. One, it reduces the ultraviolet, which the algae are sensitive to. It moves the photic zone right up to the surface, and the highest productivity we've ever measured in Tahoe up to my time, which ended in 2010 when I retired, it was extremely high photosynthesis when you could barely see the sun. And that was because the UV had been taken out and the upper nutrient zone of the lake, the epilimnion, was highly productive, more productive than any other conditions because of the reduction of the ultraviolet. Tahoe also on the global stage, my last graduate student, Jay Snyder, actually followed Gobi Desert dust all the way across Korea, Japan, and all the way to Lake Tahoe, where a small amount of it arrives. And this simply indicates the importance of atmospheric pollution globally. What happens in China affects us. And China next to us, I guess, is a major atmospheric polluter. Climate change has taken a real hit. The Pope Marsh, the largest wetland in the Sierra Nevada, and natural filtration from the runoff from the Upper Truckee River was essentially destroyed in 1946 by the 1960s. I'm sorry, it got started actually with the permits and so on in the late 50s, but actually construction was largely done in the 1960s. And I took this photograph from a student's airplane. I had a paraplegic student who was a crop duster, had an accident, and learned to fly just with his hands. And he had a Super Piper Cub that would take us up to 17,000 feet. And I was able to get this shot of Tahoe Keys during the early development. 20 years later, it looked like this. And of course, it is now a major source of Eurasian milfoil. And for the docents that were here and followed the invasive species additions, was one of the most serious, if not the most serious, addition to Lake Tahoe. We have a sash which flows into the Keys, and then when it switches back, it's like lifting a bathtub and having the water end to run one to one end and then setting it down, and it rocks back and forth. It's about a 14-hour period for Lake Tahoe. And this flows into the lake and then carries the fragments of Eurasian milfoil out into the lake, and also then provides an entranceway for warm water species to follow these shoals of Eurasian milfoil around the lake. So they're all the way to the North Shore. Every once in a while, I drop back to old themes like population, and the world's population just over 8.1 billion now, and the global water footprint is what every person uses is about 1,240 cubic meters per year. The Chinese use only about half of that, little more than half of that. And the US average, of course, is twice what the, so water supplies can become an increasingly important threat for human habitation as we go further into climate change. It's interesting how this ticking population bomb that Ehrlich made such a fuss over so many years ago is really still kind of ticking. While populated advanced countries are showing declines in populations, the underdeveloped countries are producing more and more. And it's interesting too how the global surface temperatures have sort of followed this from the Industrial Revolution, following along the same course. Now this is a slide where I need a pointer, and I don't have one on here.
Red button. It said the right button. The red button.
Oh, the red button?
Yep. Oh, there it is.
No, it should. This should be a moving picture. So I have to leave that one. That shows how the world has warmed steadily since the Industrial Revolution, and it ends up all red from being very light. This is sort of scary that just back in 2023 was the hottest year on Earth in 100,000 years. Kind of scary thought. I like this one because this shows the pole, the North Pole, with a permanent station there that they can access remotely, obviously by satellite. And just a few days later, when they took this picture, it had turned into a lake. And what's happened, of course, is the loss of albedo from the North Polar ice coverage is being lost. And as a result, the water is, of course, absorbing the heat. There's a good suggestion that the Gulf Stream is weakening, which would have really serious effects for Northern Europe. Another of our Tahoe students, Katie Walter, did her master's degree on the Tahoe Keys, and then went to the University of Alaska, where she studied lakes in Siberia and in Alaska. And this shows the other problem we're facing with climate change is the huge production of methane. And just cutting a hole through a Siberian lake, you can light the methane coming out of it. And then, if that's not enough to worry about, I want to take a step back and indicate that the disappearance of the Aral Sea is evidence that not all environmental disasters are due to global warming. So if we look at the Aral Sea in 1985, just before Stalin decided he'd divert the water to grow cotton, it looked like this. By 1997, it looked like this. And now it's a dry lake bed. Same thing would have happened to Mono Lake if a student by the name of David Mason hadn't discovered that Metro was stealing the water from Mono Lake. Can you imagine if Mono Lake was now a dust bowl like this is created? Fortunately, a limnologist, he went on to Washington State, was that, who can remind me of the university he went to? Oregon, it's in, anyway, it'll pop up later on. That's when I need my wife up front. Okay, this has just occurred, and there's no certain explanation for it, but it seems to be related to methane accumulation below the surface and then blowing up. And what would ignite it? I guess maybe a lightning strike. But this is an explosion piling up stuff around the crater, which is attributed to methane. The air is getting warmer at Tahoe. This is an update of a slide we did years ago, which beautifully demonstrated the greenhouse effect. The fact that CO2 blanket over Lake Tahoe is warming faster than the daytime temperatures. And that's simply the greenhouse effect. The cold night temperatures versus the day temperatures. And we also know from the Turk continuation of data collection that freezing air temperatures are decreasing significantly, and the lake itself is getting warmer. Nice for swimming, but not so good for algal growth, which is a longest continuous data set in the northern part of the, in fact, with primary productivity, probably in the world, and it's still continuing. One of the things that the warming waters produce, of course, are more blue-green algae. And blue-green algae can be very toxic, producing microcystine, which is a potent neurotoxin capable of killing animals like cows, dogs that drink the water. It's become quite a problem already in Denmark. And this is work from Kirsten Orick, who's a phytoplankton physiologist and taxonomist. Okay, now we go to adventures. And the first adventure was the dives in the Pioneer 1 in Lake Tahoe. We started with scuba, but we won't go into that other than to warn you that hypothermia is pretty serious. This is the Pioneer 1, who made 7 dives in October of 1979. I did 3 dives, and I think, Earl, you did 1. He saw the mice streaming down to the bottom of the lake. And we got a lot of newspaper coverage over that. And at the time, we didn't realize how dangerous this kind of activity was. My first near-death experience was when we went into a cave that we discovered dropping down Rubicon. And the pilot, being a roughneck from Texas, wanted to go in, so in we went, and then we couldn't get out. And we were stuck against the ceiling of the cave, and the thrusters, it had 4 thrusters, were insufficient to move us out. So we were afraid to drop down to the floor of the cave because then we might get, the undercarriage might get stuck. So we, all 3 of us together, the pilot, the color writer from the San Jose Mercury, and I, moved in rhythm from front to back while running the thrusters at full bore, and inch by inch we got out. Came to the surface, and wiser but changed people. Okay, the next trip was down, locating the John LeConte dragged us around, and we, the weather was changing, and I was debating whether to call off future dives or not, but being reckless and young at the time, I decided to go ahead with one last dive into the Incline Canyon. There's a canyon just like the Scripps Canyon in miniature off Incline Village, just below here. And we would drop down, and I was trying to be as Cousteau-like as possible with a turtleneck and a little cap on and so on. And we landed at 995. And I put the arm on the pilot to move to 1,000 feet so I tried to come up with something like One Step on Tahoe and the moon thing. Never came up with anything great, but he didn't want to move 5 feet deeper. So I finally put the arm on him, and we lifted up, moved over and landed, and then I could get on the hydrophone and say we were at 1,000 feet where nobody has ever been before alive. And he immediately turned the submersible around so we could go up the canyon. In the meantime, on topside, the weather had come up. They were getting seasick on the LeConte, and we were ordered to return, where we weren't able to complete our mission of going all the way up the canyon. And I'll never forget, as we were coming up through, it's like a submarine. You force water out with pressured air and increasing the buoyancy. And as we were coming up through all these bubbles, I'll never forget, the pilot turned around and he said, "You know, Dr. Goldman, this submersible's never been below 225 feet." And then I began to sweat. Anyway, we made it back, and then we called off future dives. And it wasn't until the Titan implosion that I realized how dangerous diving in a submersible can be, particularly one that hasn't been water tested below 225 feet. And it groaned and cranked all the way down the dive as it got more and more compressed. And it had a plastic nose cone about that thick that if it had given way would have been jelly. Okay, Then we go to Lake Baikal, the world's oldest and deepest lake. It's sort of the mecca for limnologists, and it's interesting to know that you could pour all of our Great Lakes in it just to fill it up. So it's an enormous volume of fresh water. And that's the Vershegen, which I dove off the top of that to demonstrate my youth and vitality on it to my students. And this is when you put something on a stamp, it's important, particularly in Russia. And they couldn't locate my good pictures of the Pisces, but this submersible, there were two of them in Russia. They were built in Vancouver, Canada, and were of good quality. But in 1983, as the senior scientist for National Geographic on an expedition, they talked me into going to the North Basin to get in that and dive, looking for what they hoped would be black smokers like they found along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, because there were hot springs there and there was seepage. And so we only dove to about 300 feet. But there we found sponges that were bleached white because they don't have the symbiotic algae growing with them, and Galamenka, which are a sculpin with a huge mouth. They're only about that long, and you can see all the internal organs. They're transparent, and they're called a candlefish because they're so rich in oil that you can dry them and burn them like a candle. And the Nurpa seals, which live and breed on Lake Baikal, actually utilize them as a main food source. So as we came along in the submersible with the lights on, they would dive into the sediments and disappear, their escape plan. And fairly recently, I think about 3 years ago, Putin went down in this same submersible. What I didn't realize at the time was that in either of our dives, there was nothing that could come after you if you had a problem. If you even just got tied up with a fish line that you couldn't break with the buoyancy, you'd be down there forever. This story, I'll try to shorten up since I'm maybe exhausting my time. Well, I've still got enough to cover another adventure or so. This is Argentina. This is Santa Tome, Santa Fe. And I went into I had a request from the UN to help people at this institute developing a river research program. And so I went down to the local Patterson Travel, and we looked at a map, and there was only one Santa Tome visible on the map, and that was in Corrientes, 1,500 kilometers above where I was supposed to go. So I land in São Borja, Brazil, and nobody to meet me, representative from the UN, nobody to meet me. So I spot it, and in Santa Tome, it's across the river, across the Paraná River, which parallels the Amazon and has much the same flora and fauna. So I wave down this kid with a rowboat and give him $5 to row me across the river. And I met with a river guard who's got a machine gun and tells me to get back in the boat and go back across. And I puffed myself up as a UN representative and opened my documents to demonstrate how important I was. And he wasn't going to weaken at all. And that's like a backup for a car. Maybe that means I'm supposed to start over again. Anyway, he spoke Guaranese, and my Spanish was totally inadequate. So he gets on his walkie-talkie and he calls for the head of the Naval River Guard at the point, who arrives in a Jeep, and he's the spitting image of Gamal Nasser. I mean, he could have been a double for him in his tropical uniform. He even had a pistol, and he has me open my suitcase, and he immediately spots the 2 bottles of Glenfiddich Scotch whiskey that I'm taking as a present to my new associates at Santa Tome. So he takes me to what looks like a little castle by the river with a huge set of these naval binoculars. And so they could cover quite a swath of the river, I guess, looking for smugglers. And we go down to the basement, which is kind of a mini officers club. And he calls in the doctor from Santa Tome and the lawyer from Santa Tome, and we spread all the documents out. And finally, after half a bottle of scotch, somebody notices that underneath Santa Tome in tiny print is Santa Fe. So I've gone to the wrong Santa Tome, 1,500 kilometers upstream. Well, this creates a problem for the Navy because I don't have a visa. They were going to issue me a visa upon arrival. And so every day we go down to the telephone office, and I try to telephone Buenos Aires and the UN to spring me. And it's always the same, situazione condizionale, which means the phone's not working, come back tomorrow. And we did that for a week. And the week I had a great time. I got them digging a swimming pool with a backhoe they had. I taught the commander how to fire his pistol, which he was totally inept at. And then we went out and bought a sheep, actually a lamb, and I did a lamb barbecue for them. And I just had a great time. But every day their problem became worse because they were holding this American incommunicado. And so they had a solution, which I'll never forget. In the middle of the night, we got a bag of meat, and we snuck into the custom office where the custom guy was in a loft just above the desk, snoring loudly. So I fed the dog while 2 sailors went to the desk, put the right date in the stamp, stamped my passport, put the original date back in the stamp, and we all snuck out of there, leaving a dog hoping we'd come again. Okay, this is adventure 3. This is really hard to believe. And unfortunately, the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who was on this expedition, is no longer alive to confirm the truth of this story, but it's true. And there may be still pictures of me at the University of Washington, which are kept under lock, I understand. It's a nude picture of me on the shore where I'm taking my clothes off and wringing out the water. So here's what happened. I set up this study of lake fertility around Alaska sockeye salmon lakes. You know, the Bristol Bay has $1 billion a year sockeye fishery. And it's now threatened by the Pebble mine. They want to go for gold, a non-renewable resource. So we land at Chignik Lake. I get the work done that they're flying me around to do, recalibrating their carbon 14. And Bill wants to, Bill Royce, the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, decided he wanted to go up to Chignik Lake, which, connected by a tortuous stream, and Chignik was still frozen, and so there was ice coming down the stream. But since I was the youngest and the fittest, I was in the water with the rope, pulling the boat upstream, dodging these chunks of ice. And eventually we got to deep enough water. Any of you ever heard of a jackass for an outboard motor? Well, it's a long handle that gives you leverage so you can lift the motor out of the water, or partially out of the water, or going over shallow spots. And they had that device. So once we got into deep enough water to use it, I hopped back on the bow of this little Cordova boat, and we started upstream following the deeper channel. We came around a bend in the stream, and a Kodiak bear, you know, world's largest carnivore, leaped up and was running. Instead of running off into the tundra as we thought it would do normally, it ran right along the shore. So Royce was able to follow the Kodiak right along shore, and I was sitting on the bow with a Voigtlander 35mm camera snapping pictures of it. And suddenly there was nothing in the viewfinder but fur. And what had happened is, while I was scrambling around on the bow trying to get the right angle on this bear, I dislodged the rope that I'd been towing the boat with, and it snaked over the side. And Royce, being at the stern, thought maybe it would foul the propeller, reached over to pick it up and let loose of the jackass handle, which turned the boat up like this and catapulted me right into the shore. And I tried hard to hang on, but to no avail. I was actually landed with both heels and my hands, both hands, on the butt of a Kodiak bear. And the bear was in full stride, and I'll never forget, it kind of looked back, you know, who the hell are you? And I, at that moment, I jumped back on the boat and I bounced. And as I bounced, Royce apparently had gotten hold of the jackass, and he whipped the bow out from shore. And I was sitting in the air for, it just seemed like a long time. I went head first into the water, hit the bottom, came up, and I felt the keel of the boat running by my fingers and heard the motor, of course, out of my right ear. And I just pushed down as the propeller went right by my face. And then I surfaced, and I looked back, and Royce had turned pale white. He for sure thought he'd ground me up. And so I climbed out, took all my clothes off, and wrung out my long underwear, got back into that cold outfit, and we went on to Chignik Lake. And fortunately there we found a trapper's cabin covered with sod that had a stove and wood, dry wood in it. So I got dried out. Didn't even catch a cold.
Okay.
Now, the last is the most terrifying. I mean, I honestly still have bad dreams about it. And if you believe in, I mean, artificial intelligence is now sending me pictures of crocodiles every day. How did they find out about this? I mean, it's kind of scary. It's crocodiles, they're pretty nasty animals. And but what's the most dangerous animal in Africa? Hippos. Hippos. While I was there, a hippo ran down a kid on a bicycle and killed him. So they're pretty bad. But this is the crocodile story. So I landed in Nairobi, got a car for my Smithsonian supported expedition to Lake Victoria, and the limnological station was just across the border in Uganda. This was before Dada Amin was feeding some of his people to crocodiles. He lived out his life in Saudi Arabia after all that. Anyway, I was able to commandeer their research boat to take me out into Lake Vanda. And I was out there where it was there wasn't a breath of air blowing, and it got hotter and hotter. And so eventually I stripped down to my skivvy shorts and started doing backflips off the wheelhouse of this about a 46-foot boat. It was a sizable boat. And I'd swim along the side of the boat and pull myself up over the stern. And the Africans, it was a pure African crew, about 5 to 7. And they clapped. I've never seen so many white teeth and so much enthusiasm about my diving performances. And on the 7th dive, as I was pulling myself up over the stern, I just happened, fortunately, to look over to my right, and there was a Nile crocodile. Its eyes were that far apart, and you could see the shadow of it at least 25 feet along the side of the boat. It was enormous. And one more dive, and I would have been part of the Lake Victoria food chain. For sure, there's no way you get away from one of those in the water. So that's the most frightening of my experiences. And we still have a few minutes left to talk about USOs. I can get a crowd like this once in a lifetime for science, but for USOs, we pulled in about 1,200 in Reno, Nevada. I had a panel of experts to consider Tahoe Tessie, whether she exists or not, including Mickey Daniels, a revered fisheries biologist guide on Lake Tahoe, who kept records on the lake trout harvest on his own for years. A terrific guy. And this is the fabulous, famous picture of Nessie, the Loch Ness monster. And it's really a forgery, one of the early forgeries in film, because that is an elephant trunk snorkeling across the river. And apparently the man that invented this hoax admitted this on his deathbed. So it seems to be, and it really does look like an elephant's trunk. So science even got interested, and my father collected this book in Paris after World War I. He stayed on as art and music critic for the Herald Tribune International issue, and bought this at one of the street smarts. There are only 3 of these books in existence, and I have one of them. So they're kind of interesting. And they showed the first real pictures of fish and the imaginary pictures of some of the things people reported on but weren't real. This book has 400 woodcuts that were used for printing it. And I was then invited by Robert Rines from MIT, who was an eminent inventor. He actually invented the sonar that was used when they discovered the Titanic. And he was a patent lawyer with about 200 patents and had a home on the side of Loch Ness. So he invited me over to join a final look for Nessie, or the remains of Nessie, he indicated, because Nessie had not been seen for several years. So he was able to afford a $1 million ROV to rent this, fly it over to Loch Ness, and we spent a week looking for Nessie. Needless to say, we did not find Nessie. But I wish I had known more about this Bob Rines. he was a real inventor. I think he had 200 patents of his own, and was able to, and after, quite honestly, after spending a week with him, doing a lamb roast for him, and drinking a lot of Scotch whiskey in the area as we toured, I never could determine whether he really believed that the Loch Ness Monster existed or not. I just never was able to make a decision on that. But Nancy found her, and that was a pretty neat consulting trip when he imported both man and wife. Now this is one of the woodcuts out of my father's book, and we've named it Asapenser tahoensis because there is a possibility, it's just impossible to prove a negative. And it's possible that a sturgeon was introduced to Tahoe by one of the many plants, particularly of Cockney, that were done. So there could be a sturgeon out there that people see once in a while, but that's about as far as I'll commit. But people get scared of almost anything. It's raining. Hey, that's good. Fire control. And some people get worried about Nessie coming or Tessie coming ashore. So they put up. Okay, I think I've used up my time, but I'm always glad to try and answer some questions.
You said you were going to tell us about the crawdads.
Oh, the crawdads. Yeah, one of the things that Tahoe has to take credit for is reestablishing the Northern European crawfish industry. Now, if you're a Scandinavian or even a Pole or maybe even a Russian, and you don't have crawdads in August, it's like us having no turkey at Thanksgiving. It's just as serious. So every August, they had these crayfish parties, and then suddenly the European crayfish, the noble crayfish it was called, disappeared. And it disappeared from a plague of North American origin, which our crayfish carry and are highly resistant to. You have those black spots you occasionally see on Tahoe crayfish are melanin deposited around this infection. But the noble crayfish, thinner shelled, has no protection against it. And even after 10 years of the noble crayfish being absent from a lake, if they put them back in, they would die immediately. So there was some intermediate host that carried the disease. So Reuben Rausing, who was at one time the second richest man in the world, a Swede who invented the Tetra Pak milk carton, decided he would solve that problem. So he sent me Sture Abrahamsson, a Swedish postdoc, on a Fernstrom fellowship. I believe Fernstrom was the person that invented the wrappers for oranges so they didn't fungus in transport. I think that's where he was able to set up this foundation, which still exists. So Sture came over and worked with me for 2 years investigating the quality of the California crayfish and its ecological concerns, and decided, along with the California and Nevada Departments of Fish and Game, that we would restock Sweden and Northern Europe with California Tahoe crayfish. So we collected, my son helped a lot with this collection. The Swedes sent us the nets that are expandable with a way for the crayfish to get in, but hard for them to get out. And we were able to collect 56,000 Tahoe crayfish, about 0.001% of the population, and ship them in styrofoam containers. You know, the styrofoam comes in a box. So we kept the box on the styrofoam and then put in wet newspaper and some scaffolding to keep them off the bottom, because they travel great moist. You couldn't obviously send them in water. That's a mistake people make in collecting crayfish, putting them in a bucket of water. They soon use up the oxygen and die. They drown. So we sent them over, and they went to Rousing's farm, where he held them in his cow barns. He had been trying to produce sterile milk by sterilizing the cow's inhabitants with steam cleaning and everything else. That didn't work. That's when he decided on jointly sterilizing the fluid and the container, which is, it's amazing. Milk has a 3-month shelf life in the tropics in his cartons. So you see them everywhere. They dispense them in machines in Japan. So we took them over, we bred them in the barn, and they were then redistributed all over Europe. So the crayfish in Europe are now from Tahoe. Thank you for your patience.